They disappeared without a trace. In July of 2014, 13 members of Troop 91, 12 boys between the ages of 11 and 15, and their scoutmaster, entered the dense wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina for what was supposed to be a weekend survival expedition. They packed light, carried maps, compasses, and food rations, and were led by a man with over 2 decades of backwoods experience. Michael Granger was well known in the community as a man of discipline and deep knowledge of the land. Parents trusted him. Kids admired him. He believed in teaching self-reliance, problem-solving, and teamwork through real exposure to the wild. The group had trained together for months prior, and the route they'd chosen was a familiar one: moderate terrain, clearly mapped trails, and within range of radio contact. The plan was simple: hike out Friday morning, set up camp near Lake Redden, and return Sunday afternoon. By Sunday night, not one of them had come back. The call started around 6:30 p.m. when the first set of parents gathered at the ranger station. Maybe they were running late, maybe someone was injured, and Granger was waiting for light before moving. But as night fell and radio silence stretched into the early hours, concern turned to panic. Search and rescue teams were deployed before dawn. Helicopters scoured the area. Ground units spread out from the last known GPS ping from Granger's emergency beacon. Bloodhounds picked up the scent along the river bend, but abruptly lost it in a thicket of trees with no trail beyond. What they found instead was a single campsite. Not the scouts, but an abandoned, fire-scorched clearing where the ground was blackened in a near-perfect circle. Bits of animal fur and claw marks lined the nearby trees. No footprints, no discarded gear, just an eerie, heavy silence that seemed to press in from the forest itself. Over the next 2 weeks, over 300 volunteers joined the search. Not one item of clothing, not one trace of the troop's equipment, nor a single body was ever found. It was as though they had simply vanished. The FBI got involved. A reward was offered, but the investigation turned up nothing. No leads, no sightings, no evidence of foul play. After 3 months, the case was officially declared cold. But some never stopped looking, and some would say the forest never really let go of them. Before we dive deeper into this chilling mystery, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more terrifying true stories and unexplained disappearances. New episodes every week. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's go back, before they were just names on missing posters. Michael Granger had a reputation for being tough but fair. A former Marine turned teacher, he found peace in nature and purpose in guiding young minds. He viewed the wilderness as sacred, a place to strip away distractions and build character. The boys in Troop 91 respected him, but the one they admired most was Caleb Doyle. 15, sharp-minded and naturally charismatic, Caleb was the de facto leader of the troop. He looked out for the younger scouts, mediated disagreements, and earned 3 merit badges in a single week. His mother called him an old soul. His friends called him the anchor. Then there was Danny Holt, quiet, observant, always a little behind the others. He wasn't the fastest hiker or the loudest talker, but he noticed things the others didn't. He liked to draw, filling notebook pages with trees, birds, and sometimes strange symbols that none of the other kids could identify. The group had spent the spring and early summer preparing for this trip. Route maps were reviewed, emergency drills rehearsed. Parents signed waivers and packed snacks. Everything was routine except for one small argument. 2 days before the hike, Caleb had mentioned to his mother that Granger wanted to try an alternate path, a less traveled section of the trail that circled around a place the locals called the Hollow. She didn't think much of it at the time, but in hindsight, it was the last clue anyone had. When search teams interviewed longtime residents of the region, they uncovered stories. Whispers of older disappearances dating back to the 1940s, hunters who never returned, fishermen who went silent on radios mid-sentence. In each case, the common thread was the same: the edge of the hollow. It wasn't on most maps, but it existed, and those who knew of it avoided it. Some of the old-timers told tales about lights in the trees, about songs heard in the wind that made men walk in circles for hours, About the hollow ones, shapes that moved just outside your line of sight. If you listened too long, you'd start to hear them calling your name. These were dismissed as mountain myths, folktales told around fire pits, and passed down from generation to generation. But the truth was, no one could explain what had happened to Troop 91. No gear, no messages, no bodies, just one blackened circle of earth where the trail ended, and a feeling that whatever took them was still out there. The days that followed the disappearance of Troop 91 were a blur of panic, hope, and relentless searching. As the days turned into weeks, the search effort became one of the largest in the region's history. But after the third week, reality set in. No signs, no sounds, nothing to give closure. The forest was closed off to civilians. Rangers were posted to prevent further exploration. Authorities cited safety concerns, loose terrain, the possibility of animal attacks. But for the families, it felt like a wall being built between them and their children. The official narrative settled into a bland and heartbreaking summary. Presumed lost due to natural causes. But not everyone accepted that. Marilyn Doyle refused to believe her son was dead. Caleb wasn't careless. He wasn't the kind of boy to let others wander off or lose track of the trail. Something else had happened out there. She was sure of it. In the months following the closure of the case, she devoted herself to digging through historical archives. She found old newspaper clippings of similar cases, scattered over decades, none with enough victims to make headlines. Hikers who walked into the woods and never walked back out. Groups who vanished during camping trips. All within a stretch of land locals rarely entered voluntarily. She started visiting libraries, talking to tribal historians, and even driving to towns miles away to collect old journals and oral stories passed down from Appalachian elders. One name kept surfacing, the Hollow. An older ranger who had served in the 70s, now retired, told her plainly, "The Hollow's not a place you go to. It's a place that comes to you." Meanwhile, Detective Raymond Saul, the lead investigator on the case, found himself haunted by the lack of evidence. He was methodical, analytical, a man who believed in structure and logic. But the Granger file sat on his desk for years. Something about it gnawed at him. In private, he'd reviewed the audio logs from the search teams. One in particular caught his attention, recorded by a ranger who had entered the same zone near the blackened circle. Static, then a low hum, then what sounded unmistakably like children laughing. When the recording was cleaned and enhanced, it revealed faint words in the background. One of them was Caleb, the ranger who made that recording quit 2 days later. Raymond began connecting dots. He mapped out all previous disappearances, overlapping them with local geological data and electromagnetic anomalies. The area around the Hollow showed irregular patterns, magnetic disturbances, compass failures, unexplainable shifts in barometric pressure. He requested access to military satellite imagery, citing a national safety concern. The footage he received showed something strange. On the day of the troops' disappearance, a small region of the forest canopy darkened in a perfect circle for 43 minutes, then returned to normal. No storms, no smoke, just a shadow that didn't match the position of the sun. Still, he couldn't get a warrant to reopen the investigation. Too much time had passed, no new evidence. No political will. Frustrated but unwilling to let go, Raymond reached out to Marilyn. What started as an exchange of information turned into a reluctant partnership. Together, they dug deeper into the legends of the region, unearthing stories that spanned centuries. In one 1857 diary entry from a settler named Elias Treadwell, there was a disturbing description of a clearing in the trees that wasn't there the day before, filled with a hum that made your ears bleed and your thoughts fall apart. He wrote of children appearing in dreams, calling to their parents, unable to cross a barrier of light. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Marilyn kept having dreams of her son. In them, Caleb stood in a forest she didn't recognize, surrounded by flickering lights and distant voices. He would always say the same thing, "We're still here, Mom, but it's not home." She started recording the dreams in detail. Dates, times, weather patterns. Eventually, she noticed that the dreams intensified around specific lunar cycles. She cross-referenced them with the disappearances. A pattern began to emerge, but patterns weren't evidence. As public interest faded, so did media attention. New tragedies replaced old ones. Parents of the other scouts began to move on, though most never truly recovered. Some refused to speak about it, others moved away, but Marilyn couldn't stop. Late one night, she received a message from a former park ranger who had remained anonymous throughout the investigation. He'd heard about her digging and said there were files that had never made it into the official record. Files with reports of light anomalies, of unexplained echoes on emergency frequencies, of animals behaving as though something invisible were stalking them. He left the box at her door and disappeared. Inside were photographs of strange growths near the last known location, fungi that glowed faintly under moonlight, roots that formed unnatural spirals, and trees split from the inside as though something had burst out of them. And one photo stood out, a blurry silhouette of what looked like a child standing in a distant grove facing the camera. Marilyn stared at it for hours, because the shirt that child wore was identical to the one Caleb had on the day he vanished. 9 years passed. The story of Troop 91 faded into the background of local memory, still spoken of in hushed tones by older residents, still present in the eyes of grieving families, but largely replaced in the public consciousness by newer stories, newer tragedies. The forest remained closed to civilians. Warning signs rusted in the rain. The trailhead near Lake Redden, once a common starting point for weekend hikers, became overgrown and forgotten. But then came Jacob Wren. At 32, Jacob was a former firefighter from Atlanta, recently discharged after a rescue operation had gone tragically wrong. Plagued by guilt and drifting through grief, he found solace only in isolation. He hiked to quiet the noise. He wandered to find distance from his past. Jacob wasn't looking for anyone. He didn't even know the story of Troop 91 when he first came across the blocked-off trail during a solo expedition through the southern Appalachian Range. It was curiosity, not purpose, that led him to pause at the rusted gate, its hinges twisted and the warning sign half-eaten by moss. He climbed over. For days he followed what little remained of the old trail, picking his way through fallen branches, faded blazes on tree trunks, and the occasional scrap of old ranger tape. The deeper he went, the quieter the forest became. Birds fell silent. Insects thinned. Even the wind seemed to vanish, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. By the fourth day, he knew he was somewhere no one had walked in years. And that's when he found the camp. It appeared suddenly, just over a ridge marked by an ancient tree split clean down the middle. Below it lay a small glade, and there, arranged in a perfect semicircle, were tents. 12 of them. At first, he assumed it was a recent site, perhaps from a hidden survivalist group or illegal campers. But when he stepped closer, he saw the rot. The canvas was stained with years of exposure, yet oddly intact. The fire pit in the center was still packed with wood, stacked neatly, untouched by rain. A circle of stones surrounding it bore faint burn marks. Personal items littered the space: canteens, scout neckerchiefs, a whistle, a compass. And beside one tent, half buried in the soil, was a spiral-bound sketchbook with a cracked spine. Jacob sat down and opened it. Inside were pencil drawings, wild, intricate, and increasingly disturbing. The first few pages were filled with innocent images: birds, trees, and a dog named Murphy, drawn repeatedly. But as the pages turned, the lines grew darker. A tall figure began to appear, always just outside the edges, a shape made of shadows and root-like tendrils. The sketches became chaotic: trees with faces, boys standing in a circle with mouths open in silent screams. One page simply read, "It watches." Jacob felt his stomach twist. He recognized the name written on the inside cover: Danny Holt. He had seen that name somewhere before. That night, as the sun dipped below the trees and the temperature dropped with alarming speed, he sat by the untouched fire pit and searched online using a satellite connection. The results hit like a blow to the chest. Danny Holt, Troop 91, vanished July 2014, never found. He looked around the camp again. Nothing had been disturbed. It was like time had frozen the space in place. The items hadn't been looted or weathered beyond recognition. There were no signs of animal intrusion. It was like they had only just left. But the trail back, the one he'd come down, was gone. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign he'd ever walked it. Jacob didn't panic. Not at first. He set up a perimeter, used chalk to mark trees, and waited for dawn. But when morning came, the forest seemed different, denser, rearranged, as if it had shifted in the night. He returned to the sketchbook. There was one image that disturbed him more than the others. A drawing of the campsite exactly as he had found it, down to the placement of the tents and firewood. And standing behind one of the tents, half hidden in the shadows, was a man with a beard and a hiking pack. He was wearing the exact same jacket Jacob had on. Shaken, he flipped to the last page. It was blank. That night, as Jacob sat in silence, he began to hear footsteps. Not heavy, not threatening, just soft, careful steps like someone pacing just outside the firelight. He shone his flashlight. Nothing. No eyes, no movement, but the sound returned. Closer now. Slow. Measured. He didn't sleep. He couldn't shake the feeling that the camp was waiting. The morning brought no relief. Jacob sat motionless beside the cold fire pit, the sketchbook clutched in his hand. The woods remained silent, unnatural in their stillness. The only sounds were the faint rustlings of leaves and his own breath, heavy and slow. He didn't understand what he'd walked into, but the rules here were different. Time felt thick. Light behaved strangely. The trees didn't just grow, they leaned. He opened the sketchbook again. He hadn't noticed it before, but near the back, scribbled faintly in the margins of several pages, were dates, entries, almost like a journal. One read, "Third night. Caleb says the lights only come after dark. We shouldn't look at them." Another, "We tried walking out today. The path just circled back. Granger doesn't talk anymore." Jacob turned the page. One sketch filled nearly the entire space. 12 boys standing around something buried in the earth. It was drawn with frantic lines, a bulbous root-like mound with spindly protrusions. Each boy's face was hollow-eyed. Caleb stood in the front, arms crossed, mouth open as if shouting, but there were no words. Jacob stared at the drawing for a long time. Later, he left the camp to explore the area, moving cautiously, always marking trees to avoid losing his way. The woods beyond the site were unnervingly symmetrical. Every few yards he found more signs, a rusted whistle hanging from a branch, a child's sock, a length of rope tied in a noose and dangling from a low limb. He followed a subtle trail of flattened grass deeper into the woods, away from the unnatural stillness of the camp. The trees began to thin slightly, giving way to a wide grove choked with vines and lichen-covered stones. In the center, he found something that made his blood run cold. A second clearing, smaller, circular, perfectly formed. This one was different. There was no tent, no gear. Just a ring of smooth stones set into the earth. At its center, a series of strange symbols had been carved directly into the soil, some resembling spirals, others jagged slashes with tails like roots. Scattered among them were tiny bones. He crouched down and touched one of the stones. Instantly, a noise filled his ears. Not sound exactly, but a pressure, like the low thrum of deep machinery buried underground. He staggered back, breath catching in his throat. The pressure faded the moment he broke contact. Jacob left the grove immediately. Back at camp, the light was dimmer, though it was barely mid-afternoon. He checked his compass, still dead. The GPS on his satellite device flickered and failed. He opened the sketchbook again, flipping through the images with trembling fingers. Then he saw it. A sequence of pages, 6 in total, drawn in chronological order. Each depicted the boys during what appeared to be their final days. On the first, they were gathered around a campfire. One boy was missing. On the second, Granger was drawn kneeling, face in hands. The third showed several boys peering into the trees while others slept. The fourth, Caleb, alone, walking toward a patch of blackness etched into the paper with hard, angry lines. The fifth page was blank, and the sixth, Jacob's breath caught. It showed the same grove he had just visited, but with a shape now rising from the center. A twisting mass of roots and limbs, crowned with what looked like a child's face, featureless, except for two sunken eyes drawn entirely in graphite. He slammed the book shut. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they circled the camp slowly, deliberately. Jacob didn't call out. He didn't move. He listened. And then, from just beyond the fire pit, a voice spoke. Not loud, not aggressive, just soft. "Are you him?" Jacob froze. The voice was young, male, uncertain. He waited, heart pounding. Silence followed. When he finally rose and scanned the trees with his light, he saw no one. But near one of the tents, the one he'd found the sketchbook beside, there were new footprints, small, bare. He didn't sleep. The next day he spent hours inspecting the camp again, now certain it was more than a place. It was a memory caught in amber. Some nights, perhaps, the veil between then and now grew thin. In one tent, beneath a pile of clothing, he found something else. A compass with initials scratched into the back. C.D. Caleb Doyle. The needle spun in wild circles before freezing, pointing north. Not magnetic north, true north. He decided to follow it, but before leaving he opened the sketchbook one last time. A new drawing had appeared, one he hadn't seen before. It was him, standing in the center of the camp, staring up at the trees, arms at his sides. And behind him, just barely visible in the shaded lines, were dozens of hands reaching out from the trunks. The compass didn't waver. Its needle, once chaotic, now pointed with uncanny certainty toward a direction that Jacob could feel more than see. It led him away from the frozen camp, deeper into a stretch of forest that grew denser with each step. The trees here were older, thicker, and bent in ways that suggested a silent, invisible force had once pressed them toward the earth. He marked his path, counted his steps, but within half a mile all his chalk marks were gone. Trees that should have borne signs of his passing looked untouched. It was as if the forest was smoothing over his presence in real time. Still, the compass held firm. Hours passed. No animals stirred, no birds called. The silence became a constant hum inside his skull, broken only by his footfalls and breath. Then the trail changed. The moss underfoot grew spongy and damp. The trunks darkened, coated in something like soot. Vines hung like drapes, blocking slivers of pale sunlight that no longer felt warm. Jacob stepped through a thicket and found himself standing at the edge of a hollowed-out glade. The air shifted. The glade was impossibly circular, like a great bowl scooped out of the forest floor. At its center stood a single massive stone, jagged and pulsing faintly beneath layers of tangled roots. It looked wrong, ancient, misplaced. Around it were symbols etched into the soil, some of which Jacob recognized from the sketchbook. He moved closer. The air grew thick. His breathing became strained. A scent like wet earth and decaying leaves filled his nostrils. His skin prickled as if thousands of tiny eyes were watching from the treetops. He reached the edge of the stone. On its surface were handprints, dozens. Some small, others unnaturally long. They were blackened, not with paint or ash, but as if the stone had absorbed whatever had once touched it. Then a voice. Jacob. He turned. A boy stood at the far edge of the glade, pale, barefoot, clothes ragged but recognizable, shorts, a scout sash, and the remains of a red neckerchief. His face was unmistakable. It was Caleb. Jacob called out, but the boy didn't move. His eyes were unfocused, like someone half asleep or caught in a dream. Then, with a slow mechanical motion, Caleb turned and walked into the trees beyond the glade. Jacob followed. He moved fast, breaking branches, calling Caleb's name again and again. The forest bent around him. Shadows stretched, distance warped. The boy stayed just ahead, always in view, never close enough to touch. Then, as if stepping through a veil, Jacob emerged into a second hollow. But this one was different, darker, colder. The sky above was a solid grey with no visible sun or cloud movement. The trees curved inward, roots tangled in grotesque spirals, forming natural arches and tunnels. And in the distance, echoes, faint laughter. Jacob froze. Shapes moved between the trees, blurred, childlike figures flickering in and out of focus. He could hear them, whispers, half conversations, names he recognized from the Troop 91 roster. Some were crying, some were singing softly. One repeated the phrase, "We're not lost," over and over. Jacob took a step forward. The ground beneath his feet pulsed like it was alive. The trees groaned softly, their bark splitting open in patterns that resembled eyes. One of the shapes stopped just a few yards ahead and turned. Danny. It had to be him. Smaller, with a sketchbook tucked under one arm, his expression was blank, but something in his posture felt familiar. Jacob approached slowly. "Danny?" he whispered. The boy didn't respond, but he didn't flee either. He simply turned and began walking deeper into the hollow. Jacob followed, the landscape warping around them, roots forming bridges over dark creeks, trees parting like curtains, the path spiraling without end. Then Danny stopped. They had arrived at a clearing. 12 boys stood in a circle, all motionless, all facing inward. At their feet was another symbol, a massive spiral cut into the ground, glowing faintly. At the center was a depression in the earth, from which mist rose steadily. Jacob tried to speak, but his voice failed. The pressure in the air increased. His vision swam. Each boy turned, slowly, to face him. Caleb stepped forward. His voice was hollow, far away. They fed on what we felt: fear, confusion, hope. Jacob shook his head. "What is this place?" Caleb's eyes shimmered. "We became part of it." And then, with a jolt that shook him to his core, Jacob understood. This place wasn't a prison. It was a feeding ground. Jacob didn't run. He couldn't. His legs felt anchored to the earth, as though the forest had wrapped around his ankles and claimed him. The air was dense, the light bent wrong, and the clearing felt both enormous and suffocatingly small at once. Caleb stood in front of him, unmoving. Behind him, the other boys remained in their silent circle. Jacob tried again to speak. "Are you alive?" Caleb blinked slowly. "Yes, but not like before." Jacob stepped forward. The boys didn't react. "What happened to you?" Caleb's eyes shifted to the mist rising from the spiral. "It took us. Not all at once. At first it just watched. Then it started testing, pulling thoughts, bending paths. When we tried to leave, the forest changed. Granger tried to fight it. That made it worse." Jacob scanned the circle. "Where's Granger now?" Caleb looked down. He tried to take it into himself. Thought it would spare us. He was wrong. Jacob felt the hairs on his arms rise. He turned toward Danny, still holding the sketchbook. "Why are you still here?" Danny's voice was soft but clear. "Because we were chosen. Or marked. Or maybe just unlucky." The mist thickened. Whispers began to drift on the air. Words that didn't belong in any language Jacob knew, but their meaning was undeniable. They were promises, threats, warnings. Jacob's heart pounded. "Can you leave?" Caleb hesitated. "We think so, but not all of us. Not without imbalance. The hollow feeds on symmetry, cycles, exchanges." Jacob stared at him. "You mean a trade?" Danny stepped forward. "Someone has to stay." Jacob's pulse surged. "No." "You don't understand," Caleb said. "Time here doesn't move the same. We haven't aged, but we've felt everything, every second, the cold, the hunger, the fear. If we leave without balance, it'll collapse. And then it spreads." He looked Jacob in the eyes. "If we stay, it resets." Jacob stepped away. "I didn't come here to offer myself up." "We didn't either," Danny said, "but here we are." Jacob turned in a slow circle, observing the clearing, the spiral, the stone. "There's another way." Danny tilted his head. "You think you can fight it? If it lives on memory, on story, on fear, then it has rules," Jacob said, "and rules can be broken." The forest groaned around them. Jacob pulled the sketchbook from Danny's hands and opened it. The drawings shimmered faintly, lines shifting beneath his fingertips. He flipped to the images of the ritual circle, the boys, the spiral, the central stone. Each page throbbed with meaning. "There's power in the drawings," he whispered. In the act of recording, of naming. Danny nodded. It fears being known. Jacob tore a blank page from the back of the book. Then we name it. The mist thickened. The whispers grew sharper, angry now. Shapes moved just beyond the circle, elongated, hunched things with too many joints and hollow faces. Jacob began to sketch, hand trembling. He didn't draw what he saw, he drew what he felt. A force that had been old before the trees grew. A hunger that crept through roots and stories. A thing without eyes, but with perfect vision. He named it in his mind, Root Hunger. As the lines formed on the page, the mist recoiled. Caleb gasped. It's working. Jacob kept drawing, pushing back the presence with each stroke. Around him the boys began to move, stepping out of the circle. The forest trembled. But as Jacob reached the final stroke, the sketchbook snapped shut on its own. His fingers burned. The forest screamed, not sound but pressure collapsing inward. Danny stepped beside him. You've opened the exit. Jacob looked at the spiral, now glowing bright with a pale blue light. A path stretched beyond it, real, tangible, leading to forest that looked familiar. Go, Danny said. Caleb hesitated. What about... I'll hold it, Danny said, already stepping back into the circle. You break the cycle. Jacob grabbed Caleb's arm. We can find another way. Danny smiled faintly. You did. Now let it work. The boys began to run. As they reached the spiral's edge, the pressure broke. A howling rose behind them, unnatural and primal. The forest howled, roots writhed, but Jacob didn't stop. He didn't look back. As they crossed the threshold, the light flared, then vanished, and behind them the hollow fell silent. They ran until the trees changed. Jacob knew it before he saw it, the subtle warmth in the air, the sound of wind returning, birdsong slowly bleeding into the quiet. He didn't stop until the oppressive pressure of the hollow vanished from his lungs. Behind him, the path was gone. The forest looked normal again. The sun broke through the branches. The spiral, the mist, the monstrous silence. It all felt like a fever dream. But the boys were still with him, 8 of them. They collapsed along the tree line, coughing, shaking, some laughing out of disbelief. The change in them was immediate. Color returned to their faces, their breathing regulated. Their eyes, once glassy and distant, now shimmered with tears. But Caleb didn't cry. He sat quietly beside a fallen log, head bowed. Jacob knelt next to him. We made it, he said softly. Caleb didn't respond. Jacob touched his shoulder. You saved them. Caleb shook his head. Danny did. Silence stretched between them. Behind, the others huddled together, whispering, trying to remember how to be boys again. Jacob stood, scanning the woods. We're still deep in, it could take days to hike out. Caleb rose. We'll make it. The forest owes us that much. And for once the forest didn't resist. The hike out took 2 days. Jacob rationed supplies. The boys followed instructions instinctively, silent, efficient, bonded by something deeper than trauma. Occasionally they flinched at sounds, snapping twigs, the rustle of leaves, but nothing unnatural returned. When they reached the ranger station, they looked like ghosts from another time. The emergency call brought sirens within 20 minutes. Jacob stepped forward, hands raised, trying to explain what couldn't be explained. I found them. The authorities didn't know what to believe, but the names matched. The faces, frozen in time, matched the aged photographs on the missing persons board still taped to the station wall. Medical teams swept in. News helicopters followed. Cameras flashed. And then came the questions. Where had they been? What had happened? Why hadn't they aged? Doctors called it a highly traumatic fugue state. They suggested cult involvement, psychological entrapment, group delusion. Nothing explained the lack of aging. Nothing explained the matching dental records, the healed childhood scars, the memories that stitched across 9 lost years like they'd never passed. Caleb refused to speak publicly, but Jacob gave a statement. He told the truth, or enough of it. He'd stumbled onto the camp, he'd found the boys. They'd been trapped by someone or something. He never used the word supernatural. He never mentioned the root hunger or the spiral. or the price paid. The government sealed the site. Satellite imaging was scrubbed. Drones were grounded. The forest was designated a restricted wildlife reserve. No official reason was given. Unofficially, the region became the subject of hundreds of conspiracy forums and underground investigations, but none of them ever found the Hollow again. Jacob wrote a book, Into the Hollow. It became a bestseller. He donated the profits to the families, but he kept certain truths out of print, the kind that twist inside your chest when you're alone. Caleb, meanwhile, started a foundation, Return from Silence, dedicated to helping survivors of unexplained disappearances and memory gaps. He never appeared in interviews, but his work spoke for itself. And the other boys? Some adapted, others didn't. 2 refused to sleep indoors. 1 spent months drawing spirals into sandboxes and refusing to speak. Therapy helped, time didn't. None of them would speak Danny's name, but they all remembered. Jacob visited Caleb a year later. They sat outside, drinking coffee, watching the wind stir the leaves. No words for a long time. "He's still there, isn't he?" Jacob asked. Caleb nodded. "He chose it." Jacob sighed. "I keep dreaming about him, like he's trying to tell me something." "Me too," Caleb whispered. They didn't speak of it again. Jacob left that night and didn't return. A week later, his car was found abandoned at the trailhead. His backpack was missing. So was his compass. Search teams combed the area but found nothing, just boot prints leading into the forest. They ended at a rotted tree split clean down the middle. Inside the hollow trunk, someone found a page, torn from a sketchbook. It showed Jacob standing at the edge of the spiral, arms open, eyes closed, smiling. The forest never gave back more than it wanted to. Jacob's disappearance reignited the national spotlight. The man who had found the lost boys, the reluctant hero who had faced down the unknown, had now vanished just like they once had. But this time, the government stayed quiet. No official searches were launched. No statements were made. Local authorities claimed Jacob had left a note, though no one ever saw it. Rumors swirled. Some claimed he'd lost his mind. Others believed he'd gone back willingly, drawn by a connection too deep to sever. Caleb didn't speak to the press, but in the following weeks, strange activity was reported near the edges of the closed forest. Drones flown illegally over the canopy lost signal. Hikers heard voices on the wind. Some swore they recognized them. One man claimed to have seen a figure standing in a clearing, motionless for hours, before vanishing into the trees. And then came the girl. 16, covered in scratches, delirious, speaking in fragments. She'd been missing for 5 months, last seen hundreds of miles away. When asked where she'd been, she repeated the same word over and over: hollow. Authorities dismissed her account as the result of trauma, but Caleb listened. He met her privately, weeks later. Her description matched what he remembered, though she had no name for the thing that had whispered to her in her dreams, or for the way the trees moved when she closed her eyes. But she drew it. A spiral. Caleb knew it hadn't ended. The root hunger, as Jacob had named it, wasn't just a presence in the hollow. It was a force bound to balance, to memory, to sacrifice. The path had been closed, but the echo remained. One by one, the other boys began to feel it. One called Caleb in the middle of the night, sobbing, claiming he'd seen Danny standing at the foot of his bed. Another refused to walk near trees, convinced they were listening. One more disappeared, left behind a sketchbook filled with symbols and a single sentence written dozens of times. He's still drawing. Caleb made a decision. He returned to the cabin Jacob had last stayed in. Everything was left as it was. Notes on ritual patterns, topographical maps marked in red ink, journal entries about emotional resonance and cognitive anchors. And one final entry. They dream of freedom, but freedom without form is just another cage. Caleb took the maps, the notes. He returned to the foundation and converted the top floor into a research room, private, restricted. There he began assembling the fragments Jacob had left behind. He contacted Raymond Saul. The retired detective had long since left public life, but when Caleb arrived on his doorstep, He let him in without a word. "You believe it never ended?" Raymond said. Caleb nodded. "I think it's still feeding, not in the same way, but through memory, through fear, through us." Raymond considered this. "So what do we do?" Caleb handed him the latest sketches from the missing boy. "I think we anchor it." Raymond blinked. "Anchor it. Contain the echo. Trap it in story, in shape. Make it visible. Give it limits." Raymond frowned. "That means reliving it." "All of it. I know." Over the next few months, the two of them began reconstructing the entire sequence of events, drawing connections between disappearances, historical symbols, emotional patterns. They began identifying a logic behind the Hollow's behavior. It wasn't random, it was ritualistic. The root hunger responded to belief, to perception, to repetition, and most importantly, to sacrifice. There was no erasing it, but it could be held, bound in form. A ritual, once understood, could be rewritten. Caleb prepared. On the 9th anniversary of the original disappearance, he returned to the trailhead. He walked alone. The forest accepted him. No resistance, no illusions. The trees bent out of his way. Trees bent. He passed the old clearing, now overgrown, but still marked by the faint trace of spirals beneath the moss. He entered the hollow one last time. At the center, where the mist still pooled faintly in the soil, he found a stone, smaller than before, but pulsing. He opened Jacob's sketchbook. He began to draw, not fear, not loss, but release, a hand held in another. A light passing from one body to the next, a cycle broken not by trade, but by choice. As he drew, the mist began to clear. The trees fell silent. The earth stopped breathing, and in the spiral's center, the faint outline of a boy appeared. Danny. He smiled. And then, with the wind, he was gone. The world didn't notice when the root hunger went silent. There were no signs in the sky, no tremors in the ground. The forest didn't announce its retreat. It simply settled, like a breath finally exhaled after years of holding tension. But those who'd been touched by it, they felt the shift. Caleb emerged from the hollow alone. No mist, no spiral, just a clearing now quiet, like any other patch of woods. But he carried something new in his chest, not weight but absence. The constant pulsing pull that had followed him for years was gone. He walked for hours, retracing a path he'd once forgotten. No illusions redirected him. No whispers tempted him to stay. By the time he reached the forest edge, the sun was rising. Waiting for him was a ranger he didn't recognize, but the man didn't ask questions. Just handed him water and a satellite phone. Within the hour, Caleb was in a hospital bed. Doctors examined him, found nothing wrong. His vitals were perfect. No signs of stress, dehydration, or injury. Psychologists scheduled assessments. Investigators filed paperwork. No one could explain why the area around the hollow suddenly registered as geologically stable again. No more magnetic anomalies, no unexplained radiation pulses. Just forest. Normal, dense forest. But Caleb knew better. The boys who had once been trapped began to find balance again. Slowly they returned to life. One began painting, spirals at first, then landscapes, then people. Another started sleeping through the night. Two of them spoke on a panel about trauma, calmly, clearly, with the composure of survivors who'd finally stepped beyond the worst of their nightmares. The foundation Caleb had built expanded. It wasn't just about disappearances anymore. It became a haven for those who lived through the unexplainable, who knew something had happened, but were told to forget. They didn't forget. They learned to hold it differently. Raymond Saul returned to academia, writing a paper under a pseudonym about spatial resonance and emotional compression zones, encoded language for what they'd truly discovered. It was dismissed by mainstream science. But a few, those who knew how to read it, understood its message. Some doors shouldn't be closed, others must be sealed. Caleb never stopped checking the forest's edge. Once a month, he hiked to the old trailhead, now clear, with no gate, no warnings. He never crossed it again. He didn't need to. He'd brought something out with him, something deeper than the sketches or symbols. He'd brought closure. Jacob's disappearance remained an open case. Some believed he had succumbed to madness, overwhelmed by the weight of what he'd endured. Others believed he had found peace within the hollow, that his choice had not been one of surrender, but of stewardship. His book remained in print. His final notes, shared with Caleb and Raymond, became the framework for understanding the root hunger, not as a monster, but a force, something ancient, formless, and bound to balance. A parasite of story, feeding on repetition, fear, and unresolved endings. By telling the story, they'd weakened it. By finishing it, they'd sealed it. But not everyone accepted the ending. 3 years after Caleb's return, a young man from Oregon posted a series of videos claiming he had found the hollow. The footage was grainy, erratic, mostly trees and muttered theories. But in the final clip, before the channel went dark, he turned the camera toward a stump in the center of a clearing. On it was a sketchbook. The camera zoomed in. The cover was cracked and familiar. Inside, a single drawing. 12 boys, holding hands, walking into a tunnel of trees. At the bottom of the page, written in a shaky, unsteady hand, was a final message. He kept his promise. Caleb watched that video only once. Then he turned off his screen and went outside. The world hadn't changed, not on the surface. Cars still passed. People still stared at phones. The sky still turned grey before rain. But he knew what it meant to walk between stories, to carry one that didn't belong, and to find your way home anyway. He sat beneath an old oak and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, there was nothing calling to him, no visions, no dreams, just quiet. And in that quiet he felt it. Not absence, but peace. In the years that followed, stories continued to surface, not of new disappearances, but of encounters, moments in the woods where time felt strange, where silence grew too deep, where a person standing alone would feel, just for a second, like they weren't alone. Some dismissed it as residual trauma, others called it psychological imprinting, but a few understood. Not because they had seen the hollow, but because they had felt the gap it left behind. An ache without language, a pause in the world where something once waited. Caleb never spoke publicly again. His foundation continued to grow, quietly helping those with unexplained gaps in their memory, strange recurring dreams or stories they'd never dared to tell anyone else. His staff learned to listen without judgment, to document without trying to interpret. Not every spiral meant something, but sometimes it did. Danny Holt was never recovered. No body, no record, no explanation. But within the Foundation's archive, his drawings lived on. Framed behind glass, his earliest sketches, simple, quiet, were placed beside the last ones, complex and terrifying. Visitors often paused longest at the final image he'd drawn before the trade, a boy walking into the woods, looking back over his shoulder with a smile that held no fear. Caleb called it the end of the echo. And yet, it wasn't quite over. One evening, a package arrived at the Foundation. No return address. Inside was a photograph, faded, water-damaged. It showed a group of boys standing beside a small river, all in scout uniforms. Granger stood in the center, arm raised in salute. Written on the back in smudged ink was a single sentence. Not all was taken. There was no explanation. No one recognized the photo's origin. But Caleb placed it beside the others in the private archive and closed the drawer without comment. What happened in the hollow had left scars, but it had also left purpose. The boys, now young men, began to share their experiences, not as victims, but as carriers of a warning. That there are places in the world older than understanding. That story has shape, and that fear, left unspoken, can grow roots deeper than anyone imagines. The world moved on, but those who knew watched. Sometimes on quiet evenings, visitors to the Appalachian trails reported hearing voices on the wind. Not frightening, just soft, familiar. One ranger swore he'd seen a figure sitting by an old fire pit, sketching in the dirt. When he called out, the figure vanished. All that remained was a stick, and a spiral traced into the soil. He never told anyone else. But he left the forest that day and never returned. Caleb passed away at 67. Peacefully in his sleep, he'd left instructions for a burial without ceremony, under a tree near the cabin Jacob once lived in. No markers, no stones, just a single page placed beneath his body. It was Danny's final drawing. 12 boys, walking together, out of a tunnel of trees, toward the sunrise. They were holding hands. One of them at the back looked over his shoulder. Some said they saw a flicker of movement in the woods during the burial, a shape, a whisper. Others said it was the wind, but no one denied the truth. The story had ended, and in its ending, the hollow had closed. If you made it this far, thank you for walking with us through this journey of mystery, memory, and survival. If you were moved by the story of Troop 91, Jacob Wren, and the quiet heroism of Caleb Doyle, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more haunting tales and true accounts that deserve to be remembered. We bring stories that others are too afraid to tell, and we never look away. And if you want to keep going, click the video that's on your screen right now to uncover another case even deeper in the shadows, one that might change the way you see the world forever.